Autism and anxiety is something that often comes hand in hand. One study shows that up to 89% of autistic individuals also meet the full criteria for an anxiety disorder or condition. That huge percentage really warrants a question of why is that happening? And we're gonna start to unpick that a little bit and see what is going on. One of the first things is an intolerance of uncertainty. So research is showing us more and more lots of different reasons why we're finding these two things together. And that's one of the biggest things that we're seeing, an intolerance of uncertainty. I really, really like this phrase because it implies that it's not just a dislike to uncertainty, but something the body actually rejects. So say, for example, you're dairy intolerant or gluten intolerant. It's not that you dislike that kind of food, it's that your body literally says, absolutely not. It rejects it. And that for autistic individuals is what uncertainty brings. Because I think as human beings, to a point, we all really, really enjoy certainty, knowing what we're doing. We like it. But for autistic individuals, it's different. It's more than I dislike the uncertainty. It's my brain and body can't process it in the same way, and therefore I'm rejecting it. How we support individuals around this is actually really, really important, and we can do it through really, really simplistic approaches. So things like visuals and social stories, which make it really clear what an individual is doing that day or that morning in school or even in the next 10 minutes, that there's certainty in the uncertainty. By providing that, we're getting rid of the chances of prediction errors, sensory overload situations, and helping reduce anxiety overall. So creating certainty in the uncertainty. The second contribution to that combination of autism and anxiety is something called alexithymia. Alexithymia is when a brain finds it a little bit tricky to be able to recognize, understand, process, track any form of emotions and body sensations that come alongside that. It was first kind of researched in around the 1970s. And again, more and more research coming out about it. What we understand is that for autistic individuals, alexithymia comes again quite a lot. So it's around about 55% of autistic individuals also have alexithymia. So that's over half of the autistic population struggling of the way to process information and to recognize how you're feeling yourself. And this is why a lot of classic talk therapies don't quite work for autistic children and young people or autistic adults. Sitting down and asking, how do you feel? Is nearly an impossible task for a lot of autistic individuals because of how their brain is just processing information differently. So we have to work differently. We have to become creative in that to help individuals understand their own body sensations, to talk about emotions from a different perspective rather than I'm feeling happy, I feel sad, I feel anxious. But what actually does that maybe visually look like? Or if you were to create it in a shape, what shape would that be? So alexithymia is a huge contribution to that increased anxiety for autistic individuals, not being able to recognize how I feel in that moment, which must be really, really tricky. This next topic honestly requires a video all of itself, but for now, I think we do have to really talk about it in the context of anxiety, which is sensory processing. For autistic individuals, we know that sensory processing is really, really different. And when we talk about it in the context of anxiety, it's key to have a bit of an understanding of what that looks like. For all of us as individuals, whenever we're feeling anxious or stressed, our senses become hyper alert, hyper vigilant. And our brains are constantly looking for threat in our space. And I don't just mean big threats, but our sensory processing works in a way that that tap that might always drip, all of a sudden you cannot stand the sound of that, or a label on your top that you're oh my gosh, if I don't get this off my body right now, because all of a sudden all of your senses are super, super heightened. But imagine if that was the baseline for your sensory processing. So you felt like that every day, all day. And your brain is having to work really hard at processing that whilst just living in our community and in our world. Now, for some autistic individuals, it's the opposite. It is hypo, so they're seeking senses, they're needing more sensory input. But if you add anxiety on top of either of those things, all of that becomes massively increased. So we just have to be really aware. Sensory processing is a big part of anxiety. And if your young person or an individual you're supporting is quite anxious, know that their sensory processing ability has also changed. It'll be harder to process information and senses in their environment. So how do we help with sensory processing and an individual who's maybe feeling quite anxious? Understanding it is key. So if you have a young person who is quite anxious, know that their senses have been heightened in that moment. If they already struggle with sensory processing, even more so now in this moment. I'm a real believer in we are proactive in our approach. So we don't just wait. So we don't wait in a classroom until that child is struggling and saying, hey, do you need a break right now? Let's send you off and have some time in the sensory room or chill time outside. We just proactively make it part of their day-to-day routine. So we create that decompression time throughout their day to help lower intensity and anxiety of those feelings. And if that's at home, it's like first thing in the morning, straight after school, rather than like jumping into homework and things like that, making sure that we're giving them that like decompression time, that it's standard, it's part of their routine, whether you think they need it or not, just making it part of their routine so their body gets used to that as well. Anxiety is a huge topic within our society and within our young people at the minute. But for our autistic young people, it's even more so. I think a really good approach to this is just taking that kind of tone that if you're working with an autistic young person or raising an autistic young person, they will most likely struggle with anxiety and feel anxious in more situations. And to take that approach of there's more going on than meets the eye. So even if you think your child doesn't look or seem anxious, know that there's a high chance like prediction and all of that stuff that's going on in their brain is working overtime. So having that real understanding is really, really important. I always say with this stuff, it literally takes one person. So be that one person. It takes one person who understands, who cares, who nurtures, who loves that young person to make them feel accepted. And we know from neuroscience, actually, a huge part of lowering anxiety is helping understand oneself, create identity, and have a sense of belonging in community. So if you create that for a young person, and whether that's youth club, school, whether it's in your home, that is such an important baseline and foundation to reduce anxiety for your child or young person.